guidelines. We have participants attending by computer and others who may be attending by phone. For all meeting attendees who wish to speak, please speak clearly and pause frequently. State your name each time before speaking. Mute your microphone when not speaking. If you are having technical difficulties, try joining the meeting using a different device such as a smartphone or tablet, or use the call-in information in the meeting invites into the meeting. And if you are not on mute, please go ahead and mute now. And Kristen, can you please go ahead and call attendance?
Yes, I will call attendance for the Planning Policy Commission. Commissioner Bader?
Here.
Commissioner Lewis?
Here.
Commissioner Milligan?
Here.
Commissioner Voice?
Here.
Commissioner Zaragoza?
Here.
Chair Fall?
Here.
And Commissioner Monahan has an excused absence.
For the Development Commission, Chair Brennan,
Here.
Commissioner Sanford,
Here.
Commissioner Soa. I do not see him this evening, and I do not remember him saying he was unable to attend. I will check in a moment. Commissioner Dillon.
Here.
Commissioner Shore.
Here.
Commissioner Price.
Here.
Commissioner Schulte.
Here.
Commissioner Ikeda.
Here.
Commissioner Morgan. I saw you say here. I did not hear you say here.
Here.
Thank you. I will confirm about Commissioner Soa in just a moment.
Ron, you're muted.
Humans aren't supposed to be muted. I like Lucy's comment. So Kristen, I have a question for you before we move forward order of business. There are meeting minutes in our packets. Do you want us to go ahead and approve those meeting minutes now, or do we want to do that at a different PPC meeting?
Go ahead and do it now because our next 7 meetings are joint meetings.
Okay,
So
excellent.
if we don't do it now, it's going to be 6 months before we do.
Understood. So for PPC members, are there any changes that you want to make or suggest in the meeting minutes? Okay, seeing none, the meeting minutes are approved. And now we're going to go ahead and actually, again, our order of business. Before we open up to public comment here, Kristen, how do we want to do this? Because the packet isn't really set up in chapters as we normally break out public comment into chapters. So how do you want to handle what's the best way to do it for today?
I would let Lucy go through. Lucy's going to give our presentation tonight. I would go through the entire presentation first. It's not very long, and I think it's easy to absorb, and it's easier to talk as one package rather than individual parts.
Very good. Then we will proceed with that. So we'll open up with public comment, and then we will have again public comment after the presentation and after some questions filtered through by PPC members. So Kristen, do you want to go ahead and open up for public comment?
Yes, if anyone would like to speak, please raise your virtual hand or press *3. Hard for me to see, so I'm going to give it a minute. No, there is no one who would like to speak at this time.
Okay, excellent. So we're going to go ahead and close public comment. And Lucy, we're going to go ahead and give you the floor for your presentation. Thanks. And
Lucy?
I'm trying.
Oh,
Okay.
For some reason, it's,
You looked perfect.
all right. Let me know when you see my screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. So tonight we're talking about building and site design and neighborhood overlay zones as part of the Title 18 update. I believe this is part of bucket number 4. And what we're going to cover tonight is background and context, as well as the update methods that we are proposing. So in terms of background, the city has places a high value on neighborhood diversity. That is goal number 8 in the council's Title 18 goals and outcomes, as well as the city is always pursuing high quality development. However, one of the challenges is that the way we have added code over the years is in layers, which has created a very cumbersome code. You can see down here at the bottom are some of the codes that we're talking about this evening. There's the land use code, which was adopted in 1995, Old Town 2001, Central Issaquah 2013, then the replacement regulations for Tallis and Issaquah Highlands in 2018, then the Central Issaquah Design Manual, which was added to the Central Issaquah standards and also in 2018, and then in 2021, the single family and duplex standards for Old Town. And so I want to give you an example of when I talk about cumbersome, what we mean. So if we start with probably one of the outermost layers, the replacement regulations for either Tallis or Issaquah Highlands, if you were a developer and you were doing a project, or you were a staff person who was trying to do some research, you'd start with the replacement regulations, and you might say, is this use allowed? What are the development standards, such as height or setbacks? But then when you wanted to know what the parking standards were, you would go to the Central Issaquah standards. And then if you had critical areas, you would have to go to the general Issaquah IMC 1810 to get those standards. And this is not only cumbersome, it's confusing because you don't always know exactly how those pieces fit together. And sometimes they're conflicting provisions or if-then statements that make it hard to know how it applies. So these are the regulations that we're referring to tonight and sort of the overarching challenge that we have. This slide assembles many of the different update methods that were mentioned in the memo. So another one of the council's Title 18 goal and outcomes is to consolidate and streamline code. So that's a starting point. We want to also remove redundancies and duplications. I've sensed some hesitation from the commissioners and the public around that. And so I wanted to give you an example of why this is important to us to try and eliminate them. It's not only inefficient and confusing and much longer code and hard to locate things, but in fact, we have to create cheat sheets of the regulations around particular things because it's so difficult to find all the pieces. So for example, if we're looking at something relatively small, like the screening of utilities and services, all those different numbers represent different provisions I would have to go look at to make sure I had a complete picture of the different tools, fencing, landscape, what you can and cannot do with utilities and services. And what we want to do, so some of them are contradictory, some of them are complementary, some of them are additive. And so we have to look at all of those and consider it, and that's time consuming and efficient and not helpful to the public, to the commissioners who are reviewing permits, to the applicants, and to staff. And so we want to create something that's clear and direct. We also want to identify specific minimum standards, be clear what the expectation is that we have. We want to incorporate best practices if they aren't already in there. We want to clarify when standards apply. Some of the examples I've given, when you're dealing with this, what we're lovingly calling the onion of these layers of code, it does make you cry when you cut into it. And so you're trying to figure out, when you're looking at the replacement regs, and then it sends you to central Issaquah, how do those two pieces relate to each other? We've tried to provide explanations, but they're not always perfect or clear. We want to identify certain standards that apply consistently across the city. For instance, there are multifamily standards in Old Town. There are multifamily standards in Central Issaquah. There are multifamily standards in the general IMC. We're not convinced that all those need to be different, that we can't have general multifamily standards that apply across the city, and then, for instance, in Central Issaquah, have particular architectural style components that contribute to creating that particular neighborhood. So we want to clarify what are good practices citywide and what are necessary to retain and enhance individual neighborhood character. In the memo, there was some discussion about Part 6 and Part 7. So let me take a minute to explain what that means. I don't know if you all have seen the proposed table of contents for Title 18. Right now, we have the title, and then under that title are different chapters. Critical areas, procedures, development standards, zoning, etc. But those are not in a particular order. And what we want to do is group the chapters into related topics. So for instance, and each of those groupings would be called a part. So there'll be an environmental part, a neighborhood overlay part, a subdivision part, so that individual chapters are more clearly grouped and there's room for expansion, so that if, for instance, there's a new subdivision technique that we want, or procedure that we want to add, we can just add it to that group and it will remain with all the rest of the other subdivision chapters. So in this case, we're talking about Part 6, which will be citywide development standards, and Part 7, which is neighborhood overlays. You can see in Part 6, most, if not all, of the chapters are listed. Many of them are gray because we're not talking about those tonight. You've seen some already. Some of them will be coming up next month. We're in particular talking about site and urban design and building design. But we're talking about those as citywide sets of standards that would be consistent. And then in the neighborhoods where there are components such as style guides, those would be in the overlays. Other standards that are unique to that particular neighborhood would be located in that neighborhood. Now, I'll give you an example of why I'm going into this in kind of excruciating detail. We have the Central Issaquah Architecture and Urban Design Manual, which we kind of shorthand for urban design or design manual. There is an architecture component to it, which you can see the list on the left. And then there is an urban design component. As we said, architecture is part of creating the character and sort of the uniqueness of a particular neighborhood. But urban design is actually universal. Good practices for creating a friendly, usable, enticing public realm are universal. And so many of the standards that exist in the urban design component of the design manual we're proposing would become the foundation for those site and urban design standards that would apply citywide. So what we're trying to do is take things apart and clarify where they should apply citywide as citywide standards and where something is an integral part of the nature of creating a unique neighborhood. Another example that was in your memo is this chart of single family design elements. And part of the reason that we wanted to show you this is you can see that, across the top are the various different codes: Old Town, Central, Highlands, Talus, and Citywide. You can see that there is a unit orientation, a parking and driveways, and a garages that's in Old Town, that's in Highlands, that is in Talus. The Highlands and Talus ones are virtually identical. Some of you old timers will remember that when the replacement regs were being created, those were actually one set of replacement regulations, and towards the end of the process, it was pulled apart. And so there's a lot of redundancy between those two chapters that could be brought together and either form the basis for citywide standards or be pulled together and not have these redundant components. But for Old Town, the new architecture for single family, the architectural standards for single family and duplex, even though it has the same components, it's not necessarily the same language. And so what we have to do is go in and look at those and say, should they all be combined into one, or should these be part of the neighborhood overlays that will create unique single family neighborhoods? Another component that we included in your memo was the developer obligations. This is related to Central Issaquah. It was adopted as part of the work plan during the moratorium. I don't actually know why it is in the Central Issaquah plan rather than in the Central Issaquah standards, but that's where it's housed right now, and we want to relocate it into the standards for Central Issaquah's neighborhood overlay. The reason is it's hard to find, and typically things that are in the plans are not, you can't enforce them like standards. There are things that were put into the standards to try and allow them to be enforceable, and we've been relatively effective, but it's really confusing because generally you don't go looking in a plan to find standards.
May I jump in? Lucy, may I jump in really quickly?
Sure, absolutely.
So the developer obligations being in the plan, though, is not the ideal reason. And some former people, or some of our older PPC members, or members who have been on here longer, will remember doing this. But this came up during the 2016 moratorium as part of the visioning process. We were asked to revision Central Issaquah, and we wanted to get more specific with each of our neighborhoods. And this was our way of doing it, was coming up with certain things that each neighborhood needed to have. But because we were doing visioning and not code, this is where it wound up. So yes, agree with Lucy, it would be better as a standard, but I did want to provide some background.
Thank you. I appreciate that reminder of why it ended up in an unusual location. And then the last component that we wanted to mention was the design manual monitoring. We adopted, as I mentioned, this new tool in 2018. The city, and when I say a new tool, it was just something that the city had never really had this level of architectural style guide before. And so there were questions, would it be effective? And there were certain components that were adopted towards the end of the process that the council was uncertain if we had picked the right method or the right components. And so one of the solutions was to monitor it. Monitoring either was supposed to happen at the end of 3 years, which was in what now feels like the early days of the pandemic, or after 3 land use permits. We've only had 2 land use permits. And when we realized that we had passed the 3-year deadline, we were at the beginning of this Title 18 process, and it seemed like an important and appropriate component of considering how we carry all of these tools forward to do this as part of that process rather than a separate monitoring. The other component of that that I think we would point out is that we have had more than the 2 projects I've listed that have used the design manual. They just have not triggered a land use permit. Additions, remodels are below the land use threshold, but they still are required to use the manual. And one of the things that we would like to hear from the commissioners about is how that is working. I mean, your thoughts about how those thresholds are applied. Should the manual only apply to new development, or should it be applied over a certain threshold? And let me show you a couple of examples as a way of explaining this. Here are 3 projects. Jackson's new convenience store at Gilman and SR 900. That's upper left. Lower left is the old Tikka Masala restaurant at Gilman Village. And lower right is the Aganas location that burned down. And the reason that I point these out is both Evergreen Ford, which did have a land use permit, and Jackson's are franchises. And several of the development commissioners will remember we talked a lot about franchises and whether the architectural standards should have any flexibility for franchise businesses. Jackson's, while they do have standard architecture, was able to, I think, apply, that's the word I'm looking for, apply the design manual. Evergreen Ford struggled. Ford and Lincoln have very specific, strict, and modern standards for architecture, which is a challenge when you're located in traditional Issaquah. And there was a lot of negotiating between the city, the car dealership, and the franchise on how to do this. And it was a bit of a struggle. I mean, I think we finally worked it through, but it was very time consuming. So franchises is one of the things that we want to talk about. On the other hand, we want things that fit into the city and don't just look like franchise city. So I'm not, by bringing this up, I'm not suggesting that we get rid of it. I just think now that we've done a little bit of this, we would like to talk about it some more. With the old Tikka Masala space and the Aganas space, what we're seeing is even though you have to fully comply if you're above a certain improvement value on the King County records, if you're below that threshold, you're still supposed to comply to the fullest extent practical and feasible. That is not the clear, that it gives you a lot of latitude for negotiating, but it doesn't provide a lot of guidance. And when you're dealing with buildings like, you know, the Aganas is just that very 1/3 northern end of the building. And then you've got 2/3 of the building that are going to remain in the original style. Now, Aganas is where it is. I'm not proposing anything different than compliance with the design manual as it is at the moment. But as an example of some of the challenges, these 2 lower examples are trying to figure out how on a portion of a building apply an architectural style which may or may not be so compatible with the rest of the building. So that is something we wanted to put out there. We think that's sort of what we have seen as some of the challenges from the design manual. And so just to kind of conclude, the top 4 boxes are I think the questions that were in the cover memo that you received. The bottom 2 are 2 of the sort of things that we have been thinking about some more. One is this question about the design manual and whether it applies just to new development or above a certain threshold of remodel or change. And then, you know, because we are hosting the Development Commission to provide us with some boots on the ground experience, we want to know if there are particular tools that they're looking for or think would be useful in improving their ability to do an effective job. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So we'll go ahead and open it up to Commissioner questions. And if you have a question, go ahead and please put it in the chat and I'll call on you.
Should I stop sharing my screen, or do you have enough of the information?
I would suggest keeping it up there because you might need to scroll through it if a commissioner wants to point something out.
Okay, I'll leave it up for a moment.
And just to be clear, and as a reminder, don't put the question in the chat, but either put the word question, just put the word question in the chat, or later the word comment in the chat. Thank you.
The first question is Nina Milligan. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fall. This is Commissioner Milligan. Thank you, Lucy, for the excellent summary and for the packet as well. I only have a couple questions right now before we get to hear from the public and some other things. And one had to do with the developer obligations. You're asking whether we should move them to another place, but you're not asking whether they should be applied citywide. Am I understanding that correctly? That's my first question.
Yes, so we're not proposing at this point to change the obligations. We may fine-tune the tools, and we're only proposing, we're still treating them as a something that would be part of the neighborhood overlay.
Okay, so in that way, it would cover more than Central Issaquah.
I'm sorry, as a component of Central
Central
Issaquah's neighborhood
Got it.
overlay. Thank you for
Okay,
clarifying.
thank you. Okay, so it would be in the neighborhood overlay of Central Issaquah, the developer obligations, and they don't exist anywhere else. Okay, and then next question has to do with process. And I was going to ask you if you could briefly remind me about how we get input on this process, for instance, from Issaquah Highlands. And I'm remembering it, especially when we look at the design manual monitoring, we said that we were going to put the replacement regs in, and then we're going to come back a year later and get input. And then how is that, how does that inform what we're doing today as part of the public input?
Well, we did do the neighborhood, a year after the Issaquah Highlands replacement regs were put into place, we did go out and have the neighborhood meeting. Then the pandemic happened and we haven't really done much beyond that in terms of implementing some of the concerns that were raised. So Kristen may be able to confirm this better than I am, but I believe that all of the packets are going to, for instance, Tallis and Issaquah Highlands HOAs. Minnie had a very long and detailed conversation with Sarah Hoy. And so, and we have an interested parties email list that these packets are going out to, and we're very interested in including any groups that might have particular insight into, for instance, neighborhood obligations.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Ron, you're muted.
Sorry about that, everybody. Thank you very much, Nina. And the next question is from John Ikeda or Akita.
Thank you, Commissioner Paul. This is Commissioner Ikeda. Just a couple questions. When you say that there's been multiple or redundant standards, when they conflict, is the more stringent standard being applied?
Well, in this case, the example I gave you was not necessarily more strict or less strict. They were just different ways. You know, do you use landscape or fencing to screen these services? So I think what we're looking for is selecting the most effective, clear, and easiest to apply. Not that we're trying to take the easy route, but to pick ones that clearly and directly convey what our expectations are.
A clear direction then, clear design intent then.
Exactly.
Another question on this, I think they're called neighborhood spaces or neighborhood overlays. Is that generally referring to an architectural standard you'd be developing for those spaces?
Well, they could be building design. They could be other standards that are particular to neighborhoods. And I don't want to distract us because I'm going to give an example. If people don't like it, save it for the circulation discussion that Stephen Padua is going to bring in February. But for instance, Issaquah Highlands and Tallis have trail standards. The city doesn't have really any trail standards. So, you know, there's some things that apply to neighborhoods that we are discussing. Should those remain unique to that neighborhood, or do they, like the urban design component of the Central Issaquah Design Manual, provide a good foundation to create standards for the whole city? So we're having to look at each one of them and say, just because it lives with a neighborhood right now, does it belong with that neighborhood permanently, long-term? Or is it the foundation for a set of standards that could be applied citywide?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Akita. And Commissioner Brookie Shore, you have the floor.
Hello. I have kind of a follow-up question on what you just said, or maybe two-part question. So there could be some regulations that don't right now apply to an area, but they could, through this change, apply somewhere new. How is that approved or decided that that change will be made?
So first of all, we are having each of these sort of gap analyses and update memos. That's phase one. We're getting to the end of that phase. We're going to then release discussion draft code that will be available for not our usual 1 week before the meeting, but several weeks, probably about a month. Then we're going to hold some open houses for people to come ask questions. We're going to reconvene PPC and whatever board or commission was providing some expertise, and then have a deliberation session. So we're holding a series of meetings. We're trying to track how we're making, so we're trying to make the proposals now. That's our update method that we're talking about this evening. And then we are looking for feedback as we go through each of these steps to say, why is this applied citywide? Why isn't this applied citywide? Why isn't this just limited to a neighborhood? And, you know, as I describe these things, we're still in the kind of early stages of figuring these out. So although I know I'm sometimes overly successful at speaking with confidence, please feel free to say, I don't think that's the right way to go. You know, we are really here to have a conversation with you to understand whether we're headed in the right direction before we invest a lot of time writing something that we could have found out early on was maybe not the right direction to go.
And when that's presented, it'll be kind of like a track changes kind of thing. So we will be able to see where something's been added or deleted or.
We are not doing track changes, and I will tell you it would be illegible if we tried to do that. But for some of the PPC members and maybe even Development Commission, if you followed closely, when we did the sign code, it was a similar process. We were pulling in the, and there was an example, I think it was in, let me look. So the way Appendix B1 of the memo was prepared, you can see those orange boxes that were in B1 are they're lovingly titled change explainers. So they are really describing what is the source and are we combining multiple items? Are we selecting one thing over another? And then as you'll see when we release our first external drafts, I believe next week, we are trying to identify at a high level if certain things were deleted so that we're not doing a word for word track changes. Some sections it's not possible. If we have a single chapter, we are trying to do a much closer, finer grain track changes. We're really trying to give the big idea of what we're carrying forward, what our sources were, and the things that were removed and or retained.
And thank you, Commissioner Brookie. Thank you, Lucy. Commissioner Richard Sanford, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you. This is Richard Sanford. Lucy, I want to kind of go in the order of your main 4 questions. The first are their concerns with consolidation of the documents. And I guess this is a 2-part question. I'm taking it that not all of the content in the external documents will be promoted to the code. I'm thinking of things like statements of purpose, maybe performance standards, recommendations, guidelines, that kind of thing. So the external documents will continue to exist under this plan, is that right? And if they do, there's still a hierarchy of precedence, isn't there, in determining what standards apply or what information a developer needs to look at to be able to understand the full set of requirements? That's question number 1. And
let me add, because that was a lot of a thought, and I want to make sure I don't lose the pieces of it. So I think that there's some really important things in there. Probably, I don't think we're not trying to make big policy changes. We're trying to carry forward the policies that the city has worked so hard to develop. We're really trying to put it into a format that's clear, streamlined, consolidated, easy to use. I do think that we're less likely to carry guidelines forward, and when we're using performance standards, we're going to probably try and be clearer about how to evaluate whether a performance standard has been, how would we know if it's been met? So those are some of the sort of best practices. And then where we have multiples, I think we're trying to pull it into one coherent thing. We're not getting rid of purpose and intent statements, but if we're combining multiple chapters, we're going to pull those together into one set of purpose or intent statements. Does that make sense?
okay, yeah, and I guess I just want to clarify, do those external documents still exist after the Title 18 revision, or have they all been promoted, as it were, into the IMC?
So by external documents, if you mean like the comprehensive plan and the central Issaquah plan, those documents will exist outside as our vision. They will not be part of Title 18, but they are authorized, they are adopted, and they are effective in establishing our vision. The standards, the things that are in Title 18 are the standards that we need to implement and achieve that vision. So the vision documents will exist. All the various standards that are in Title 18 are proposed to be updated, consolidated, and replaced.
Okay, considering the SIDS then, will the SIDS continue to exist with its Chapter 18 Architecture Design Manual?
So the design manual is proposed to being pulled apart with the urban design component, the urban design part becoming the foundation for citywide urban design standards, the architectural part becoming part of the neighborhood overlay for central Issaquah.
Okay, so all of that document then is intended to migrate into the IMC in some form. And
Yes.
yeah, and I'm thinking, I guess, of the design manual, in which there's a lot of information there in terms of illustrations, photos, things like that, that, you know, everybody says are worth 1,000 words. And I'm wondering how is the code machine will be able to handle that.
There have been a lot of conversations among our team with the entity Code Publishing that hosts our code, because we have found with the version that we are currently and have historically been using that it was difficult to get the level of visual graphics that we felt were necessary for some of these codes, which is why they existed outside of Code Publishing. We feel much more confident now that we will be able to integrate images. If you've happened to look at the sign code, which had many more images, photos, and drawings, those have, by my estimation, been incorporated. They're very clear and they're easy to read at Code Publishing. So we feel pretty good about being able to have a more visual and graphically rich code posted there than we have in the past.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I think it covers my second question, which was, would content then continue to exist redundantly in these outside documents after it's been migrated? And it sounds like no. At cutover time, the other standards documents disappear and all that content in the code is approved.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Sanford. And another question here from Commissioner Brennan. But before we move forward, I just want to make sure that if there are any questions that any of the commissioners have, please go ahead and put them in the chat now so we can go ahead and spool you up. And Commissioner Brennan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fall. So maybe this is more of a comment and less of a question, but as I'm listening to the discussion and just reading through the materials, the part of the challenge with this is there's a lot of blending together of things that are mostly like administrative in nature, like corrections and fixing, eliminating redundancies, providing clarifications if the language is creating confusion. The structure of the code, meaning is it organized well, is it easy to follow, is it understandable? So a lot of that stuff is really kind of more of an administrative nature. Where things start to get blurry a little bit for me, and maybe as this work keeps moving forward, you can try to part this out and maybe organize it. The substantive piece is when we're talking about, you know, like the expanding best practices, you know, geographically. So if there are certain standards that apply in some part of the city, and they are considered really the best practice, or other parts of the city don't even have that standard, and it's something that the city wants to do. That's a substantive change. If you're going to expand the code to cover a broader area of the city, it might make sense, but it is a regulation that doesn't currently exist now in that geographic area. The other areas we're talking about, the updates to like the design manual, and the architectural standards, like in the urban design and architectural design requirements. Those are substantive changes that you're talking about now, as part of the way that's been described, at least in the memo and the way I understood you, and the way you described that, Lucy. So that is another area where these are changes that put in place new regulations or different regulations than currently existed. And those are the areas where people need to understand what those changes are from a public engagement, even from the commission engagement standpoint, because those are a new requirement. I guess the final piece is, when we're trying to figure out what is kind of the best way to integrate all of this stuff together. And there is some areas where I think you were talking about pulling down, got what you described it as, the developer obligations, and putting those into the code as more of an enforceable element of the code. There may not be written in code language, so they're too broad or general. So that's another area where I think substantive change should be looked at. So I guess my point is, if you can somehow part out those things that really are administrative, and I have a ton of confidence in the staff's ability to figure out how to organize the code and correct those things that are errors or fix the redundancies. I think where the most benefit for the commission would be is understanding where the real changes are, what I call the substantive changes to the regulation or expansion of the regulations, so we can understand what those are and provide comment. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Brennan. And Commissioner Lewis, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fall. I want to start by saying it's always such a pleasure to work with you, Lucy. This presentation was fantastic. This packet was fantastic. When I first got it, as you know from our email correspondence, I was a little dumbfounded because there's a lot of goals here, right? It's kind of the heart and the meat before we even get to our rough draft of code. And so I really struggle with figuring out how to address the methodology. I think where I've come to right now is that one of the things you brought up was a concern about the consolidation. And I think it really depends on how it's going to be constructed and how it's going to be tested out before it's rolled out. So right now, the methodology looks really sound to me, right? I'm not being presented a lot of different options, though, to be able to say this feels better versus this. What I can say is that this feels like an improvement. And so go forth, right? I like this so far, but how it is on paper and how it actually ends up looking and being displayed out is going to be very different. So it's a cautionary thumbs up, right? Of saying, okay, yeah, I want to see more. I appreciate the walkthrough. I really do. And I'm wondering if really that has to do a little bit with, the ability to use digital tools in how we move forward versus that kind of old school paper and ink, the way that we used to have to go through code and thumbing through this way and that way, right? And hoping, again, this is, step M through Z, is being able to say, okay, now that we have what we want, how does it actually look? How are we interacting with it? How are we touching it? And it struck me when I was going through this document that I realized I've never built an Issaquah, right? As I've sat in this seat and sat on other boards and commissions, but I've never actually had to use the code, right? And it very much struck me when going through this methodology that I look at the code, I look at our policies, right? I have my fingers in all of it, but how it actually ends up coming out on the back end, I have really very little clue about, right? And so it's going to be very interesting to have you guys, when you come back to us, being able to say, this is why this is better, because this is how it's going to be, right? And I would really appreciate almost a user experience that will be completely hypothetical, and to be able to say, when people come in and need to use our land use tools, this is how they're going to be able to do it. I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel like this is a very two-dimensional concept right now that's going to have to get sharpened up at some point, right? Right now we're a square, we're going to need to become a cube kind of a thing. So I'm just very struck by how how more I need to know about this. Does that make sense? Right. So I really appreciated this time that you guys took with us to really start this process on the methodology. And I was struck too by something you said about the gaps analysis portion ending. And what I like to think of it as more is our gaps analysis will now be evolving, because as we go into our rough drafts, we really do want to keep the intent and the heart of gaps analysis continuing, because we want to be able to have that evolution, right? That addressing what have we removed, why, what are we adjusting, why, how are we tweaking, and why, right? Which is really the heart of our gaps analysis that we've really been pushing staff to, is to kind of explain to us what hasn't been working. So how are we addressing that so that we don't so we use this opportunity wisely, right? So I would encourage a little bit of a different approach. Maybe, I know it was just a word choice, but I'm just going to use it to really plant my flag on that. The other thing that I want to ask a question about, there is a question here, I promise, is about the design manual and how it applies to. When you said new versus a threshold, give me an example of a threshold. 20%, right? Like how much of the building are we talking about?
So I'm going to take a step back and
Yeah.
provide just a little information on the first part, and then I'll answer your actual question. So I appreciate what you're saying, and I want to start by saying that this presentation and this memo is a whole bunch of us working on it. I'm just like I am pay pretending that this is my building. So this represents a lot of staff time and thought, and trying to figure out from many different perspectives how this is presented. And how to succinctly explain this. Second, we have been meeting with affinity groups throughout this process, with developers, with different kinds of users, because we're interested in exactly the kinds of experiences that you're talking about. Property owners, retail owners, residents, different groups have been meeting and telling us sort of what's working and what's not working with different parts of the code. These are kind of the early days, and then we go and we once we've had these conversations, we start actually working through the code process, and we're going to learn things, and I'm sure we're going to have policy questions along the way. We are taking several weeks for staff to read these, because, and not just staff in CPD, but for instance, on bucket one, we've got people from parks and public works and other departments reading this and saying, does this make sense? How will this work? You know, I'm concerned about X, Y, and Z. And it's really helpful that parks and public works are looking at this, because they're a kind of a customer too. They build things in the city. So they have these experiences just like you're describing. Then we'll have our external drafts that go out along with an open house where people can come and ask questions. And I'm not even necessarily covering everything, but I'm just saying that we are trying to reach out and get many different perspectives to try and understand, are we creating the tools we need? I see Minnie has turned on her camera, and I'm guessing she maybe has something to add.
Thanks, Lucy. I think if I understood the question correctly, you were wondering what the threshold is where we apply the architectural styles. Is that what you were asking?
Yes, Lucy gave us two wanting us to weigh in on the two, and I'm curious where that threshold is.
Yeah.
Would be.
So my understanding of the way right now, the architectural style. So you have to pick out of the 5 or 6 of those styles. For obviously for new development that applies. But if you're redeveloping your property, the threshold is 50% value, but it doesn't distinguish between what you're doing to the outside of the building or what your tenant improvement costs are. So if you're just upgrading your HVAC, for instance, or any mechanical equipment inside, that can get pretty expensive, and you can easily trigger bringing your building into compliance with these architectural styles. We don't think that was the legislative intent, but the language in the code kind of binds you to how those projects trigger compliance with architectural style. So we do need to look at that to distinguish perhaps the exterior improvement cost. And so one option is to take a, break down the redevelopment cost into how much of it is exterior and how much of it is interior, and then establish. Um, it's much easier to say this is the style you have to meet if you're building a brand new building. It's a whole another situation when you're adding a small addition or adding screening on your rooftop, or small little things that they have to go through this elaborate process to show how they're in compliance with an architectural style. So that was, I think, the problem we had kind of posed in terms of solutions. If you guys have any ideas, we can bring back some options for your consideration of how to establish a threshold that makes sense for these smaller buildings,
Thank you.
renovations and additions. Yeah.
That is very interesting. To me, that's actually a very different conversation uh, that I also wasn't aware of when I was reading this. So I think that's a kind of a separate discussion, unless you guys are prepared to have it today. But it sounds like that's something that we really, when going through the rough draft and looking at the language of being able to say and propose something, right, to obviously submit to council saying we think that this is appropriate for them to be able to make that decision on. And Lucy, to your point, absolutely. I love hearing how many stakeholders we have involved, especially code enforcement, right? I think it's a fantastic department to be running a lot of this by, and the people who are going to be saying, well, I'm going to be applying this. How does this read to me, right? And being able to kind of go to the source in a way. So I really appreciate the work of everybody on this. And I really think that we're on the right track. What we want to avoid is to make this something that is not user friendly for the small individual, right? For the small builder, for the small business owner. What we want to do is not make this something where you do need to have your corporate lawyers involved and to be able to have this, right? You know what I mean? And so how do we make this, all of this, right, so approachable? You did such a great way of laying out that we do have all these different pieces, right? Our design standards, Old Town, right? Central, right? We have all these components that we've worked on. And so being able to wrap it up in a way that also feels simple. So, I mean, no pressure or anything, but thank you very much.
Right, and just to your point, Joy, I would add on to what Minnie said, which I think is a really important part of this, but I want to acknowledge what you're saying, which was, we knew that the monitoring of the design manual needed to be a part of this process, and we wanted to put that on your radar and be open about the fact that during the pandemic, this deadline passed. And we're also been working with these property owners in the examples that we identified. And we're hearing challenges about that. But we recognize that we didn't lay out the questions quite as clearly as we needed to, that we kind of identified that monitoring was a part of this, but didn't really provide some of these examples or discussion topics. And so there will be time at our next week meeting where you can ponder this a little bit if you want to pick this up again next week. And I think the point that Minnie's making, that is an important one, and I'll give you another example. The Friends of Youth building, this isn't under Central Issaquah, but it's not dissimilar in the Old Town neighborhood. The Friends of Youth building's value is only $3,000. So if you replace the windows on that building, you have now triggered full compliance. Well, let's say full compliance means you're supposed to be at the street. We're not going to make you tear down the building and move it. I mean, there's just, it ends up with a lot of uncertainty and lack of clarity around the very kinds of issues that Minnie identified. Interior tenant improvements, HVAC upgrades, or the two that we showed you, like the Eganas and the Tikka Masala upgrades. We want those kinds of upgrades happening. We want people to be able to do work in our city. And it's hard on everyone to sort of figure out the best way forward. And so we'd like to really make sure that we have some guidance from you all about what those thresholds are.
Well, if your goal was to get us excited for the nitty gritty, it worked. We're so excited. We're ready. We're ready, guys.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Lewis. And yes, we are very excited. All right, so we're going to go ahead and Commissioner Milligan has the floor.
Hello, Commissioner Nina Milligan here. Thank you, Chair Fall. I have a follow-up question that is inspired by Commissioner Sanford's questions, and it might be similar to what he was asking, but at least it's related, and it's something that I need to clarify now so that I can incorporate it into my comments later. Lucy, when you're talking about not losing things, we have a couple things, and of course I'm going to go on the Issaquah Highlands filter because that's the one I know the best. And so we have the guiding principles and the urban design guidelines. How do you incorporate those, or how do you not lose those when you bring them into the other type of documentation?
It's a great question, Commissioner Milligan. The way they're incorporated currently in the replacement regulations is they are attachments and they are used as part of our review. But I'll say that the goals and guidelines, well, the goals in particular are more like a central Issaquah plan than they are something that we can use for review. We have used them that way, but I don't know that it's best practice. So I think that's something we're going to be exploring, whether we carry, whether they become attachments to the neighborhood overlay for Talus, for Issaquah Highlands, Central Issaquah Plan for Central Issaquah, Old Town Plan for Old Town, or whether we try and do something else. And, we're having this initial conversation, and I'm not sure we've gotten much further relative to that particular piece.
Okay, and thank you, Commissioner Milligan. And Commissioner Sanford, you have the floor.
Hi, I just wanted to pick up for a minute on Commissioner Lewis's point regarding usability. And this meeting really isn't chiefly, I don't think, about usability concerns, but I think they were great points in that this really seems to me, it's basically an information architecture challenge, and it's a website project, and it's a documentation project. And I assume that at least I hope, that our prime consultant on this has experience in all those areas. But I think that there is expertise that's required in this project to make that happen. And I hope that, usability testing certainly all the way through is a prime component of that. I wanted to move on just a minute to, are there concerns with applying urban design citywide? And I think Commissioner Brennan alluded to this. I'm thinking of the urban design section of the architecture and urban design manual. That's really what we're referring to. And when we worked on that, the assumption was that that was high density and that it was a grid kind of orientation of blocks there. And there was wording about through block passages and maximum block size and enclosure and those kinds of concepts. And I guess I'm just wondering about, are those really applicable equally across the city? I guess maybe my question is, what do we mean by citywide there? I understand it's supposed to apply to commercial, mixed use, and multifamily only, right?
Yes, that would be my expectation as well.
So I guess, would that be applicable then equally to any place in the city that could have any of those types of uses?
You tell me.
Okay. And I guess that, and I guess Commissioner Brennan said those are really substantive pieces. So I don't hold the key to that, but it seems like that's pretty fundamental stuff.
Okay, and thank you very much, Commissioner Sanford. I don't see any additional questions. So, Kristen, let's go ahead and open it up for public comment.
All right, if anyone would like to make a comment, please raise your hand, virtual hand, or press *3. We do have someone who would like to speak, Connie Marsh. I am making you a panelist. And you are unmuted. Go ahead, you may turn on your camera.
Okay, I'm trying to lower, there we go. I'm using my cell phone. Okay, so you in theory can see my aquamarine wall. It's unusual. Interesting conversation, complicated though. Here are my overarching goals. We have spent a lot of time creating character areas in our town. And as you put these new tools together, the character areas need to stay consistent. And I think you have to be very careful when you do that. And I would suggest you go out to all of these neighborhood overlays. They may have no idea that they have a neighborhood overlay, and introduce them to what you're doing. Because I think when we start talking about neighborhoods in this town, the community doesn't even know. And so you're using tools that Issaquahians are blind to, right? And then simplicity. So when you start making comments about, well, citywide, I think you need a map to show what this means. How much of this town is not already covered by some of these standards, right? How much of our commercial area or multifamily is actually outside of the central Issaquah area or outside of the urban villages? And some we have the Murr area of Old Town, etc. So interestingly, they don't have neighborhood character pieces yet. And so you're talking about overlaying character pieces for some places that have it and some places that have none. So is the intent to go back and create a neighborhood vision for these blank areas, or are you just going to tell them what they're going to be? I like the idea of enforceable standards in the central Issaquah area to help ensure that we get the character that we have intended. However, I don't think that you should do that yet. I think that if those follow already in what we envision, then those standards should be there. But I think the whole city needs to do a project about envisioning what their neighborhood character should be and how they should be protected and what rules should be allowed. And you've got plenty else to do. Now, if you see, because you have experienced that it's not working and you must establish those standards so they're enforceable because we're not getting what we want, that's another question. But you have not given me any data to let me know that that is actually a problem at this point in time. And you say it's difficult. I guess I don't really understand what difficult means. You talk about amount of negotiating time. I'm not sure what your definition of success is. Do we expect to reduce our amount of negotiating by half? What is our end goal with that? How much flexibility do you want to have? None? Zero? Do we want 5% administrative adjustment of standards? Do we want 50? So when you say more simple to use, I wish I had an idea of what you meant. and what you were aiming for, because I watched the struggle. I've lived the struggle. I read the darn stupid struggle. But I guess I want to know better how you think this is going to fix that struggle. Because you say it will, because then it will be more defined. Nothing is ever that defined. So you understand, Lucy might understand more what I'm gabbling about than everybody else, because she watches me pound my head against the wall for the last 20 years. And we have gone back and forth between prescriptive and flexible. And here we go again, but what is the sweet spot? And how are you going to define it? And then how are you going to correct it? Right? So I want maps, because I want to see what this means. When you're talking about central Issaquah plan design standards, we clearly don't want those everywhere. If we're keeping the same setbacks, like side and front setbacks, we aren't going to be able to apply those standards in places. It won't make any sense at all. So I don't think those are going to work everywhere, and we don't want our city all to look the same. And so I am concerned that it won't get us what we want. We can't have a citywide architectural standard yet have our neighborhood characters in the method that you're aiming for. You see, a language, English is my first language, and I find it very, very difficult. But in the end, I think it does need to be simpler, but I need more direction on where you think you're going, and what time you expect to save and how you expect to save that time. Then one little segue on to thresholds. Well, we all know for critical area standards, if something burns down, they get to stay in the critical area however much they want to. So you could, for the case of something burning down, just switch that over to architectural standards. But that's just the burning down situation or natural disaster. Okay, I think I'll stop now. Bye.
And Kristen, is that it for?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was moving her back. I apologize. It took me a minute. Let me see if there's anyone else who would like to speak. Please raise your hand. I'm checking the message box in case anybody wants to send a message to me that way. I know I can never find the hand to raise. No, there's no one else who would like to speak.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it back to the commissioners for discussion. Are there any commissioners who would like to further discuss these topics tonight? Go ahead and put them into the chat box, please. Not seeing any. Here we go. Commissioner Milligan, you are the first one. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Fall. Commissioner Milligan here. Thank you, Lucy, for all your answers to the questions. And then I just wanted to summarize some of the thoughts that I had while reading the packet and listening to your presentation, and folding in the answers to your questions, and in no particular order of priorities, just where it is on my piece of paper here so I can keep track. The developer obligations seem to me worth looking at, as because they're very holistic. They seem very kind of ethical sort of level of things. They're not so specific that I wanted to look more at them being something that we could have citywide. To me, it seemed of interest that way. I just wanted to state that opinion. And then I wanted to talk about allowed deviations, which we didn't have any questions about, but this was one of the things I wanted to bring up as something I have an eye for. When the example in the packet on page 23 of the packet talks about window transparency or whatever it's called, and that we would have allowed deviations based on the use inside. And you know what, I just can't imagine that being necessary, and the allowed deviations frustrate me because we have a rule for a reason. And if we provide allowed, that means that you're going to be getting uses, say on the ground floor, that aren't the uses that you want anyway, because the uses you want on the ground floor are the ones that are active and transparent and interact with the sidewalk. And then if we say, oh, okay, but you can put uses in there that don't interact with the sidewalk, then, and you know what, really, it works out more often than we think. I mean, who would have thought that dentist offices could be on the ground floor of retail and it's okay? And I remember the first time I sat in one of those chairs and the window's right next to mine. But you know, it's actually a nice active sidewalk because of that. And then I also want to bring up at this point for your consideration to be mindful of how looking through the window doesn't always get you where you want to go. Ulta is a problem, but then do we want to allow window, what do you call them? You know, like when I walk by Nordstrom, certainly I do love looking at the mannequins and they're in the window. Anyway, I didn't see that we covered that well enough. Just point of observation. Then the other thing that I want to talk about, it has to do with those guiding principles and design guidelines. These things are really important in Issaquah Highlands. And one thing that I get concerned about is that they are guidelines and they have encouraging soft language. And yet I think there's an expectation that they're actually standards. And I think it would be worthwhile to find out where those are standards. And one of the reasons why I brought up, let's go back to that year following review to see if we got public information that allows us to improve upon that, so that fences, front porches, things like that that are really important in Issaquah Highlands can become perhaps stronger language if that's what is desired. And then I can't help but comment about franchises. I am so proud of the cities that put their foot down and Starbucks comes in and looks so awesome in their town, or McDonald's or whoever it is who says, oh God, you mean I have to do it with your standard? Aren't they awesome? So I hope that we can have strong standards that do allow for development in our community, but preserve our community character. And then the last one that I wanted to comment about, I'm just going to do it all, guys, and then I'm sitting down. Unless Commissioner Lewis says something that I have to comment to. But okay, here's my last one. Lucy, you were talking about some neighborhood standards being so good that you might apply them citywide. That sounds cool. And, you know, we've done that so many times and we've learned through the development agreements that, hey, this is pretty cool. Let's do this citywide because we learned something. But here's the caution that this is what popped up in my brain I thought could be a problem. Okay, so you take something that's really important to Issaquah Highlands, let's say fence height, and you put it citywide, and then somebody in South Cove gets mad about it 10 years from now. And so then you change the whole thing, and then Issaquah Highlands loses what they thought was important to them because it became a city-wide standard. So I don't know how to prevent that, but I just wanted to put a note that how could we continue to protect the neighborhood standard when it goes citywide and then differences of opinion fall in later on. So that's it. And back to my earlier comment, really great work. I think the process is going well. Really appreciate all your public engagement. Thank you for the reassurances of talking with our neighborhood communities and leaders to make sure those neighborhood overlays are getting the attention that they need. And thank you, Development Commission. I love having you guys here, and put some comments. Oh, good. Mel Morgan's coming up. That's Commissioner. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chair Fall.
Thank you, Commissioner Milligan and Commissioner Morgan. Mel Morgan, go ahead and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Fall, and hopefully everybody can hear me now. And a big thanks to Lucy and to Kristen and your whole team for the package you put together and the great presentation, Lucy. I appreciate it. In terms of the answers to your questions, the concerns and thoughts, number one, the consolidation of the documents, I think is an excellent idea. The process you're doing here makes a ton of sense. The standards that the city have from a developer's perspective can be considered hard or easy, but the understanding them should always be easy. That's a goal we should always have. Number two, applying the urban design citywide for commercial and multifamily. I would agree with that because our various standards, I think, have evolved over time from back, say, in 95 to today as the city evolved and grew, and certain areas of the city were evolving and growing at a fairly rapid pace and changing. But we've changed a lot over these 25 years. And now we're at a point, I think, where we can have some development standards that apply for commercial properties citywide. Where that threshold is and where you have neighborhood overlay beyond that, I'm not sure. But I think there should be some design standards that we can apply citywide. The retaining some neighborhood specific standards, I think we definitely should have those kind of overlays. The areas that did evolve, especially the Highlands and Talus and the urban core and Old Town, I think we've seen some very good evolution in those areas that should be respected and retained in those neighborhood overlays going forward. And that also, well, that'll get to my last comment. Number four, moving the developer obligations. I think that's an excellent idea to put those into Title 18, again, to simplify it so a developer can look in one spot to find everything they need to do. The threshold for applying to the design manual, I'm sorry, I don't really have a very good idea. You make a great point, Lucy, about Friends of Youth and percentage of assessed value. Good luck. The tools that we could use, I would harken back to the green sheets that we used to use in the Development Commission, which I thought were an excellent tool, I would think, for a developer and both for us on the commission level and reviewing projects to be able to walk through and say, here's everything that this project has to meet, those standards, and how are we going to judge them? And in this case, you could have the basic standards designed citywide, and then you're going to have a plug and play for each of the neighborhood overlays that gets added into that. I think those kind of green sheets, if we can distill what we do in Title 18 into the green sheets, I think it means that we've done a good job in Title 18, making it clear enough for everybody to understand what we're looking for. And again, the citywide versus neighborhood can be addressed pretty well in there. And again, thanks for everything you've done on this, and thanks to the Planning Policy Commission for allowing us to join in. Thank you.
Ron, you're muted.
Sorry about that all. So I like to second what Mel just said. I think that what he just came up is with his ideas about the green sheets and breaking it out into the subjects and the core, I think was a great idea. It would help me wrap my head around this project because this is really, it can be confusing, just a lot of information, and it be a very methodical way to kind of bring this out. So I am not hearing also a lot of questions from some of the other commissioners. So I want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to be able to say something here. So um, if you have a question, please go ahead and put your question into the chat so I can go ahead and call on you. Otherwise, We've got a comment from Commissioner Bader. Excellent, it worked.
Yeah, this is Sarah Bader. I succumbed to the peer pressure, mostly because I don't know if this is even valuable, but it's where my head is stuck. Again, I don't even know if it applies, but what I'm thinking about is like what stops us. So we do all of this work right now. We streamline all of these different documents, and then in 3 years, we realize that there's a need for a set of design standards that apply to a certain thing. Do we end up back in 15 years time in the same position we're at now with code and then a whole bunch of other things, or like what's the path to like sustainability for this document that we don't end up kind of where we're at now?
Well, I'll start. Minnie, I'm sure, has some ideas too. I think partly what I would say is, we started with this bifurcated, historically, we've had this bifurcated system of the land use code that was adopted in the late 90s. And then a couple of areas like Old Town where we did a lot of focus, and then a bunch of development agreements. And I think that's part of the importance of this Title 18 with parts and chapters is it's providing a much more sustainable structure. It will, mean that we have to regularly revisit it and make sure that we aren't coloring outside the lines. But I think we're creating a much more sustainable structure that we can tend much more easily without growing another onion.
Okay, so go ahead,
Sorry,
Nina.
Chair. Yeah, I was just going to add that with this consolidation and big overhaul and looking at it from, comprehensively, is our hope is that we provide a framework, a skeleton, whatever you want to call it, with a broad brush approach that everything kind of falls in its place. And then if the community desires and the policies change, or there's a desire to kind of tweak few things or redo a few things, that framework will exist, and then that it'll sink in much better, as opposed to having this meandering path of 10 different documents that currently, if any change now, you don't have that framework in place because it's all bifurcated and it's somewhat linked, but it's not quite linked. So this exercise will hopefully get the framework set up, but it won't prevent the community to kind of have a conversation about anything that's not working, to have to go back and change it. Um, but it won't, that's the hope here with this exercise. But excellent points, other points that were made tonight as well, in terms of deviations that have a vague language. Obviously we want to get away from those, because then what's the point of having these standards and discussions when we can have pretty broad deviation ability. Yes, there needs to be some flexibility for unusual circumstances, but it doesn't need to be the example that was shared today. Um, the area-wide, the city-wide, I think we'll be very careful with not taking things and pushing it on neighborhoods that they don't belong. But like someone, one of you said, this may be the beginning of the once you get the full code, at that point you will be able to, the devil's going to be in the details at that point, to kind of see that, does this make sense for citywide or not? And if it's a natural context, that the building should respect the natural context, does it matter whether it's in central Issaquah or in Old Town or somewhere else, if you're building? So those kind of things perhaps will apply everywhere. We are going to have a discussion with all of you on circulation and parking. And one of the things in there is this through block passage, which should be different in more urban context and should be different in central Issaquah as opposed to applying it citywide. So perhaps those things will get nuanced and worked on. And we've learned through our implementation that some tweaks there may be necessary, not changes in policy, but perhaps what's working on the ground or not. So we'll bring that for your discussion in February, but tonight's discussion was the site design and the building design aspects of those two, and it sounds like this design manual and bifurcating into architectural and urban design, we can continue that conversation at our next meeting. So we provided the links to those to the design manual, and I think Development Commission is very familiar with it. Some of the things you all were talking about is having those green sheets or more of a structure to what is a criteria and what is a guideline as we bring forth projects for approval, having a very detailed document that doesn't has a list of things but not a very clear, here's the criteria you have to meet and here are some ways you can meet it. Perhaps we can take that feedback. The green sheets, Lucy can speak to that, but I think what we've heard was they were in addition to the code. Sometimes they were not in sync with the code. Sometimes they were different from the code. So there were some issues, I think, from consistency and language was too broad. So even if, there would never be an instance where someone could say this doesn't meet. But I think the intent there is to have really clear criteria for approval as Development Commission is looking at, to say whether this criteria has been met, and then you have some guidance of how the criteria can be met by these guidelines. So we're happy to take any other feedback. I think that's what I've heard from our discussion tonight. Okay. Back over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Minnie. And it looks like we have a comment from Commissioner Lewis.
Thank you, Chair Fall. Minnie, I really appreciated your comments right there. I think that when we talk about consolidating and streamline, something that's kind of been missed from the conversation is that also our intent is really to strengthen our code. We talk so much here in PPC about how we put our intent into the policy, but the teeth is in the code. There's so many times that we're working on really difficult things, coming together as a community and deciding things, and we say, wait, the teeth will be in the code. We'll get there, right? And this is really our opportunity to strengthen our code and to really have unequivocally clear and strong language, right? To be able to actually have strict code that gets us what we want, what we've already stated as a community in our policies. So I think it's not just about framework. It's not just about usability. It's also about that result. So I really appreciate your comments. And I really want to put that emphasis too on, I think, Connie made the comment about what's the sweet spot. And it's a tough line. We're expecting a lot of you guys, but we also expect in this consolidation to really get to the meat of, here's where we really need to really buff up our code to be what it needs to be to align with our community values and our policies. So thank you for that hard work.
Thank you, Commissioner Lewis. Commissioner Richard Sanford, you have the floor.
Thank you. This just occurred to me from the discussion, and then I think Director Dollywell just covered it. As we're migrating this content, it sounds like a lot of recommendations, guidelines, performance standards, and so on will be moving into the code. And it seems to me that it's going to be very critical to distinguish between guidelines and requirements when we do this structurally within each chapter and part, so that it's really readily understandable. Or it seems to me we could be creating more conflict and confusion between guidelines and requirements when they're all in the code together. So I guess that's my point.
And thank you, Commissioner Sanford. I am not seeing any additional comments from commissioners, so last call. Not seeing any new ones, so I'm going to go ahead and close out that, and we're going to go ahead and move it over to Kristen to go ahead and talk about new business.
So, yeah, first I'll start with the calendar. DC might be interested as well. I did not include a calendar this week because it is in flux right now. We have some potential changes coming to it. So I will put that in the next one. However, I wanted to mention on the last calendar, and this is for PPC, I'm going to need to see a show of hands. On the last calendar, I included an additional meeting where you will actually be the visiting commission. And with the environmental board. And that is for Gary Shemek to talk about the work that has continued on the stormwater master plan. And the other one. But I need to be sure before we do that, that would be on March 9th. Then you have a meeting on March 10th. Then you have a meeting on March 24th. So I just want to be sure that before we're fully committed that we can have a quorum at that meeting. So if you could, how am I going to do this? I'll just ask real quick. Let's see. Commissioner Fall or Chair Fall, would you be able to attend?
I can't commit.
Okay. Commissioner Boyce?
I believe so.
Okay. Commissioner Lewis?
Yes, I can attend March 9th.
Excellent. Commissioner Milligan?
Yes, I can attend.
Excellent. Commissioner Bader?
Yes, most likely.
Okay. And Commissioner Zaragoza?
Most likely. I'll need to check, but I think so.
Okay, great. I think we'll have, did I leave anybody out? You keep skipping around on me. I think we'll be okay then. Great. So I'll leave that on the calendar. Thank you. As for council updates, I do not have any. However, I know that many wanted to talk about the Monday night's council meeting.
Thanks, Kristen. Council's been looking at shopping cart regulations. So they, this community has had an uptick in abandoned shopping carts. Upwards of 40 shopping carts are left at the transit center or at the corners and things like that. And it's somewhat tied to theft issues that happen at Target and other places. So there was a big community, a lot of community members spoke at the last council meeting, and council considered an ordinance to address the issue for abandoned shopping carts. So if you're interested in that topic, you can watch the council meeting, but there is a new ordinance in place, which basically allows the businesses, requires the businesses to put some signage on their premises that people can't walk away with the shopping carts, and two, to have we can identify what the shopping carts are, and if we find them abandoned, we call them and they come and pick them up within 24 hours. If the abandoned carts continue for 3 times or 6 times in 3 months or something like that, then that particular business has to come up with a plan for how they're going to manage their abandoned shopping cart. So as you're out and about in the community and you look at this and have some feedback for us, or some suggestions on how to tackle this problem, please let us know. So that happened. The other thing I think that relates to Title 18, we're working with the city clerk to set up some briefings for our council on Title 18. We had gone and done a study session with them earlier during this process, but we are scheduled for February 7th to go give them a status update of all the things we've been working with the boards and commissions on. So that's happening on February 7th. That's all I have, Kristen.
Thank you. I did have one other thought. This topic, we're intending to carry this over to our next meeting with DC as joining us again. Is there any other information that you all need from us, or if you need it, if there's something that will help this discussion move along, email me during the week, and you may go sit and have some dinner after this and go, shoot, I forgot that. So feel free to email it to me, and we can get you more information for next week. Yeah. And before next week's meeting starts, we're actually going to have a public hearing that should probably last not more than 30 minutes, and then the joint meeting will start. That's all.
Thank you, Kristen. And if there's no other business, then we will go ahead and adjourn at 8:15. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the commission, for the